Hello, my name is Ken Carano, and I am a professor in the Division of Education and Leadership at Western Oregon University. It is an exciting time to be an educator in Oregon. Recently, the legislation has passed for new ethnic studies standards, a new Holocaust and genocide curriculum, and a new tribal history, shared history curriculum, which we will be discussing in this video. We're excited that you are considering joining the teaching profession in Oregon. As an Oregon with a lived experience, often not taught in the curriculum, you're going to be able to join a field that is focusing more and more on cultural pluralism and tribal history and shared history. Today we're going to be talking about tribal history, shared history, and a framework that can be used when teaching this curriculum in the classroom. The framework we're going to be using is a critical Indigenous orientation that was created by Dr. Leilani Sabzalian, faculty member out of University of Oregon. This framework is also often called the 6 Ps, as you will see why soon. Joining us today, we have 6 panelists who will join in the discussion and some activities with us. Hello to you out there. Thank you for joining us. The critical orientation of Indigenous studies has 6 principles or orientations, as you can see on this slide: place, presence, perspectives, political nationhood, power, and partnerships. We're going to go through each of these 6, give some classroom examples, and our 6 participants are also going to be doing a couple of these activities as well. Our first principle is place, and as you can see, place is about you're always on Indigenous land. In this one, you can look at, be talking about local Indigenous peoples, lands, nations, seeking out Indigenous names. Another thing that you can do with place is to do a land acknowledgement statement. For background information, one place that you can go to do a land acknowledgement statement is nativeland.ca. It is an app that you can go in, put a zip code, put an address in there, and it will give you names of the ancestral land that you're on, the tribes that have been in there. I do want to make note, though, that it is an imperfect system. It may not actually give you every single tribe that has been on this land, but it is a place to start as a teacher. While doing a land acknowledgement statement in the classroom, one item that you could do is you could make a poster and have a land acknowledgement statement in your classroom up there for every day. One thing I do want to say, if you are doing a land acknowledgement statement, is make it sustainable. Don't just turn it into something that you're just saying once or saying on a weekly basis as kind of a checkbox. And in order to make it sustainable, one thing you could do is teach from this framework. Bring in Indigenous voices into the classroom as you are teaching. The second principle of the critical orientations is presence. And as you can read up here, presence is breaking that myth that Native Americans no longer exist. There are currently, within the United States, over 570 federally recognized confederated tribes and over 6 million Indigenous peoples in the United States. One activity I like to do in the classroom is to have students discuss what they've seen in media portrayals, in their textbook portrayals of Indigenous peoples, and then do a gallery walk of contemporary Indigenous peoples and compare and contrast what they've seen in textbooks, what they've seen in the media, with what they're actually seeing in contemporary history. In addition, with presence, I am excited to say that we have 2 members of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde who are joining us today. Would you be willing to say hello and introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Justine Flynn Nikanim, Nika Chagukaba Shawash Ilai. Hi, my name is Justine Flynn, and I come from the Confederate Tribes of Grand Ronde.
So hi, I'm Zoe Nika Yako, the Shawash Ilai Tilakam Nika. Hi, my name is Zoe, and I'm a member of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde.
Thank you to both of you and all of you again. Our third principle in this critical orientation is political nationhood. And with political nationhood, this is discussing and teaching students that Indigenous peoples are nations. They're not minorities. An activity that you could have your students do is to have them analyze treaties the United States has made with sovereign tribal governments. Additionally, you can also have students compare and contrast government types between different tribal nations as well. Another activity that you could have students do closer to home in Oregon is to have students map the locations of the 9 federally recognized confederated tribes in Oregon. In fact, our panel has already done this activity. So I'm going to find out from them what they learned from doing this activity. Jennifer, please, what did you learn from this activity?
I learned that I don't know the locations, and I didn't know there was a huge gap in my knowledge. This was a huge eye-opener for me.
I was the same way the first few times I did this, actually. Somebody else willing to share what they learned from this activity? Yes, Gerardo.
This was something I didn't learn when I was in school before going to college, and it's something pretty awesome to learn about this and where the tribes are in Oregon.
Agree with you right on. I certainly wasn't learning about this when I was growing up either. Louisa, yes.
Yeah, it's odd to think that I've driven all over Oregon and through different tribal lands and not really noticed, because we weren't really taught to recognize it even when we see it. And like, I've driven through Canida and I've never thought like, oh, this is the Warm Springs Reservation. So that was interesting for me.
Yeah, I agree, because when I drive around the state of Oregon, until I started being educated about this new tribal curriculum, I missed a lot of that too. So it's like I'm learning a whole new land now too. It's been very exciting. Thank you for those answers. Our next principle for the critical orientations is perspective. And with perspectives this is looking at bringing in the Indigenous voice, teaching through an Indigenous voice rather than about Indigenous peoples. There's a variety of ways that you can do this. One, you could challenge wording that's often used in the curriculum, such as in textbooks. Like, for example, instead of Western expansion, you could look at using the words encroachment or invasion. Another way that you can bring in Indigenous voices is through Indigenous literature. For example, the book The People Shall Continue, which was written by Indigenous authors, talks about Native American history on this land when European settlers were here and before European settlers were here. And you can contrast that with a story often told from a United States settler perspective during that period of time as well. What are some other ways, panel, that you could see perspectives being used? Abby, yes.
Right. Yes, I think that, as you mentioned, using Indigenous authored books is really important and can bring an entirely new perspective to issues that are oftentimes misrepresented in textbooks. For example, the book Apple Skin to the Core touches on the issue of the often unknown history of boarding or residential schools and the damage they inflicted upon Indigenous families under the guise of assimilation.
Yeah, that's boarding schools. That's one also that we don't hear about much about, and that is an important one. And the book that you mentioned is also by an Indigenous author. That a great book. I highly recommend that. Thank you, Abby. Does anyone else have something they would mention on perspectives? Yes, Justine.
Something not often thought about is the fact that Native Americans enter the military at a higher rate than any other race in the country. For Natives entering the military, it's not just about protecting the United States, it is also about protecting their homelands and the connection they have to them. And that's a unique perspective on something that's pretty common.
Wow, now that's powerful. There's a perspective that you rarely hear as well. Thank you for bringing in those perspectives. Power is the 5th principle. And with power, here's an example where these critical orientation principles can often overlap, because power can also overlap with perspectives. With this one, it's about challenging the power dynamics within the curricula. One of those ways of doing that is what I had mentioned with perspectives, is with wording. Another way is analyzing what non-native authors have said as well. Another way to do this is with an activity that I'm going to have the students do. In this activity, the students are going to analyze some photographs from a non-native photographer, Edward Curtis, who was a photographer in the early 20th century that had gone to many tribal nations, especially throughout the West, and had taken thousands of photos of Native Americans. You have probably seen many of his photos in textbooks growing up or in coffee table books, even in movies as well. He had a reputation, though, of manipulating his photos. So for this activity, our panel has already read an article on Edward Curtis's manipulation techniques, in which he would do things such as make the Native Americans dress up in traditional regalia rather than what they were normally wearing. He would white out certain objects that were in the images. He would also zoom in on photos so you wouldn't see things on the outside like automobiles or other modern technology that was around in the area. So what I will be having the students do in this activity is they will be analyzing these two photos. These are both from Edward Curtis. Edward Curtis took the photo on the top first, and as you can see, there's a clock in here. Below is the photo that he uses when he finally had it printed and published in places, and all of a sudden, that clock is missing. So the participants will go through these questions. How is the updated bottom image different than the top photo? How does this change the portrayal of the indigenous people in the image? And what is the danger of this change? With that in mind, who would like to share their answer? What is the danger of this change? Zoe, yes.
By removing the clock from the photo, the photographer is creating the image that suggests that Native people didn't have access to technology. And in doing so, it's perpetuating the stereotype that Native people only exist in the past. And these kinds of images keep the idea of Native people kind of in a time capsule rather than as like actual people who have adapted with the times and are still here.
That is a great point. What a great point. Thank you for sharing that. Would anyone else like to share? Jennifer, yes.
Yeah, I believe it changes the power dynamics by showing the indigenous people as romanticized and mythical. And this is dangerous because it creates an otherness.
Absolutely. I completely agree. Louisa, yes.
Yeah, going off of what Jennifer said, I think that the edited photo is definitely othering to Indigenous people and their culture. And instead of showing how the community lives, the photographer just manipulated it. And he did that probably instead to fit the skewed white narrative of Indigenous people instead of actually showing their culture.
Yes, I agree. Thank you for sharing that. Our final principle in the critical orientations is partnerships. And in this principle, this is cultivating and sustaining partnerships with indigenous peoples, tribal nations as well. Would anyone like to share on ways that you think we could do partnerships?
So one way you can build partnerships is just by reaching out to someone from a local tribe and asking them to come visit your school. One thing that we do in Grand Ronde is, I teach middle school and high school Chinook Wawa language classes, and another tribal member and I just got approval to teach the school's first Indigenous Studies course for high schoolers. So.
Wow, that sounds exciting. I'd like to take that course. Would anybody else want to share for partnerships? Yes, Justine.
Another way of doing this is to visit tribal campuses and connect with tribal programs to support what you're teaching. You can connect students directly with what they're learning by also introducing them directly to tribal culture. I encourage you to create land acknowledgements and then support them through teaching the curriculum to help students learn why they're important.
Thank you for that. That was great. Well, I want to thank all of you for joining me today and talking about these 6 principles, this Indigenous critical orientation. And thank you to the viewers out there. I want to leave you with a resource that is up on the screen, and this is the Oregon Department of Education's Tribal History Shared History site that you can go to and get more resources on the Tribal History Shared History curriculum. Not only resources, but that also includes lesson plans made by the 9 federally recognized Confederated tribes as well. Thank you for joining us.